My father disappeared on a Tuesday in March, which felt wrong even then, because nothing important ever happens on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are for dentist appointments and grocery runs, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a house when everyone inside it has already given up on the day. They are not for disappearances. They are not for the moment your whole life changes shape and you are left standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning holding a coffee mug that is too hot to drink, staring at a chair that is too empty to look at, try to understand something that does not want to be understood. His name was Raymond Calloway. Ray, to everyone who knew him well, which by the end was not very many people. He was 53 years old the last time I saw him, though he had been looking older than that for a few years already. The kind of older that does not come from age, but from something harder to name. He had his mother's jaw and his father's hands, big and square-knuckled, the kind of hands that were built for work and had done plenty of it, though toward the end he had mostly stopped. He liked black coffee and country music from the 70s and the particular silence of early mornings before anything had gone wrong yet. He was not a perfect man. I want to say that plainly because this story does not need to be cleaned up to be told truthfully. He was not perfect, but he was mine, and when he left without a word, he took something with him that I'm only now, years later, beginning to understand was never actually gone. I was 18 years old. I want you to sit with that for a moment the way I have had to sit with it. 18. Old enough to be considered an adult by every legal definition there is, and young enough that the word adult still felt like a costume I had not yet grown into. I had graduated from high school the previous June and was working the morning shift at a diner 2 miles from the house we rented on the east side of Millhaven, a town in eastern Pennsylvania that most maps do not bother to zoom in on. I had been saving money for community college in the fall. I had a plan, which in retrospect seems almost funny. The way a plan always seems funny when life decides it is done waiting for your permission. My father had been struggling for a while. That is the careful way to say it, the version that does not assign too much blame or too much pity, the version that keeps things level. He had lost a job at the machine shop in November, the same job he had held for 11 years, the same job that had put food on our table since my mother left when I was 9. He had been drinking more than he should, though not in the dramatic way you see in movies, not throwing things or raising his voice or making terrible scenes. He drank quietly, which in some ways was harder to watch. He would sit in his chair in the living room with the television on and a glass in his hand and stare at something that was not in the room. I would ask him if he was okay, and he would say he was fine, and I would know he was not fine, and we would both pretend the way families pretend when pretending feels like the only kind of kindness left. The last morning, he was up before me, which was unusual. I heard him in the kitchen. I heard the coffee maker. I heard the back door open and close once, and then I heard his truck start up in the driveway, and then I heard it pull away, and then I heard nothing. I got up and went to the kitchen, and his mug was on the counter, rinsed out, and turned upside down the way he always left it. There was a $20 bill folded under the salt shaker. That was all. No note. No explanation. $20 and a clean mug and the sound of a truck engine fading out somewhere toward the end of Garrett Street. I waited 3 days before I called anyone, which probably says something about how complicated our situation was, or how stubborn I was, or both. He had disappeared before, briefly, twice, both times surfacing at his brother's place in Allentown after a few days of not answering his phone. So I waited. I called his brother Dale on the second day, and Dale had not heard from him. I called the 2 friends I knew he still had, and neither of them had heard from him either. On the third day, I called the police and filed a missing persons report with a young officer who wrote everything down in a small notebook and looked at me with the particular expression that people give an 18-year-old girl who is trying to hold herself together in a public building, which is a look that means I'm sorry, but also I am not sure what you want me to do about this. They found his truck a week later, parked at a rest stop off Route 80, the keys still in the ignition, a half-empty thermos on the passenger seat. His wallet was in the glove compartment. His phone was not with the truck and has never been found. There was no sign of anything violent. There was no sign of anything at all, really, which turned out to be its own particular kind of horrible. The case stayed open. It still is, as far as I know. Raymond Calloway walked out of his life on a Tuesday in March and left almost nothing behind, and the world mostly kept moving, the way it does, indifferently and without apology. What he left behind, besides $20 and a rinse coffee mug, was a storage unit on the south side of Millhaven, on a stretch of road between a tire shop and a closed-down bowling alley. I did not know it existed until a letter arrived 6 weeks after he disappeared, addressed to him at our house, from a storage company called Keystone Self-Storage. The letter was a billing notice, which meant the unit had been in his name, and he had been paying for it every month out of money I had not known he had. The unit was 12 by 12. The monthly fee was $68. According to the invoice, he had been renting it since I was 11 years old. 7 years. My father had been paying for a storage unit for 7 years without mentioning it once. I held that letter for a long time at the kitchen table, reading it over and over the way you read something when the words are clear, but the meaning keeps sliding away from you. 7 years. I was 11 when he rented it. That was the same year my mother left, the same year we moved from the house on Chestnut into the rental on Garrett Street. The same year my father stopped talking much about the future and started talking mostly about getting through the week. I had spent 7 years growing up in that house and eating dinner across from him and driving with him to the hardware store on Saturday mornings, and not once had he said a word about a unit at Keystone Self-Storage on the south end of town. Not once. I did not go right away. That is the honest truth, and I want to tell it honestly. I let the letter sit on the table for 4 days. I went to work. I came home. I made myself dinner and watched television and told myself I was fine and knew I was not fine. And on the fourth night, I lay in my bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and finally admitted to myself that I was afraid. Not of what was in the unit, or not only of that, but of what it might mean that I had not known about it. There's a particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the possibility that you did not know someone as well as you thought you did. That the person who made you breakfast and drove you to school and sat with you through 3 seasons of bad television was also, somehow, a person with a locked room you had never been shown. The storage facility was open from 7 in the morning until 9 at night. I went on a Saturday in the late afternoon because I had worked the morning shift and I needed the hours of the drive to prepare myself. Except that you cannot really prepare yourself for something when you do not know what you are preparing for. I had called ahead and explained the situation to a woman named Patty at the front desk, who had been kind and practical in equal measure, the way people in small offices often are when they have seen enough of life's complications to stop being surprised by them. She told me I would need a copy of the missing persons report and some form of relationship documentation, and I had both, and she told me to come in and they would handle it. The unit was in the second row, number 47. Patty herself walked me out, which I had not expected and was grateful for in a way I could not have explained. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a lanyard and sensible shoes and the brisk, unhurried manner of someone who has learned that moving steadily through difficult things is almost always better than moving fast. She did not ask me questions. She did not try to prepare me or warn me. She just walked with me through the rows of orange metal doors in the late afternoon light and stopped in front of 47 and handed me a bolt cutter for the padlock because I did not have a key. The padlock was the heavy kind, dark with age, and it took me 2 tries with the bolt cutter before it gave. The sound it made when it went was sharp and final, the sound of something being decided. I stood in front of the door for a moment with the broken lock in my hand before I reached for the handle and pulled. The smell that came out was the smell of him. That is the only way I know how to say it. Not unpleasant, nothing spoiled or damp, but the smell of a man's specific life. Motor oil and old paper and something faintly cedar, the same smell that had lived in the flannel shirts he hung on the hook by the back door. I had not expected that. I had braced myself for almost everything else, but not for the smell of him meeting me at the door, like he was still somewhere inside. Patty said she would give me some time and step back to the end of the row, and I was grateful for that too. I stood in the open doorway and let my eyes adjust to the dimness because the fluorescent light in the unit had a cord pull, and I had not reached for it yet. The unit was not full, but it was not sparse either. It held the organized accumulation of someone who had been putting things away deliberately for a long time, not the chaos of someone who had dumped boxes in a hurry. There was a clear path down the center. Things were stacked neatly against both walls. Nothing had been thrown in at random. Every box was labeled in my father's handwriting, which is the handwriting of a man who learned to write in the era of shop classes and technical manuals. Clear, blocky letters, no cursive, no flourish. Just the word and nothing extra. Against the left wall, there were boxes labeled with years. 2009, 2010, 2011, going forward from there in order, a stack of them, all the same size. Against the right wall, there were larger boxes, unlabeled, and several plastic bins with locking lids, and what looked like a guitar case, which surprised me because my father had not played guitar in my living memory, though I had a dim childhood recollection of a guitar leaning in a corner somewhere, in a house before the house I grew up in. At the back of the unit, on a folding table he must have brought in himself, there was a single cardboard box that was not stacked on anything and not labeled with a year. It was labeled with my name. I saw my name on that box, and I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit without planning to. I just sat down, the way your body sometimes makes decisions your mind has not caught up to yet. The light was still dim, and the smell of him was still all around me, and my name was on a box in my father's handwriting in a room he had kept secret for 7 years, and I was 18 years old, and I was very much not ready for any of it. But I was there. I had come. And after a long moment, I reached up and pulled the cord on the fluorescent light, and the unit came up bright and sharp all around me. And I stayed sitting on the floor for a while longer before I stood up and started to understand what I was looking at. I started with the yearly boxes because I was not ready for the one with my name on it. That is the truth, and I am not ashamed of it. There are things you approach directly and things you have to come at sideways. And a box your missing father labeled with your name in a storage unit you did not know existed is firmly in the second category. So I opened 2009 first because that was the earliest one, because that was the year everything changed, and because I needed to understand the beginning before I could understand the end. The 2009 box held documents. That was what I noticed first. Not objects, not photographs, but paper organized and deliberately kept. There were pay stubs from the machine shop going back to January of that year. There were utility bills, all paid, all filed in order by month. There was a manila folder labeled Simply House, and inside it the lease agreement for the rental on Garrett Street, signed in my father's hand, dated April 2009, 2 months after my mother left. There was another folder labeled Cecily, which is my name, and inside that one were my school enrollment papers, my immunization records, my birth certificate in a plastic sleeve, and a handwritten list of my teachers' names for that year with their phone numbers written next to each one. I sat on the floor of that storage unit and held that list and thought about my father sitting somewhere, at the kitchen table, probably in the early morning before I was up, writing down the names of my fourth grade teachers and their phone numbers, making sure he had them, making sure he was prepared, making sure that whatever else was falling apart around us, the things that mattered were accounted for. He had done this every year. That was what the boxes were. Each one was a year of our life together, documented with the quiet, methodical care of a man who did not trust that things would hold together on their own and so held them together himself, in the only way he knew how. The 2011 box had my 5th grade report cards and a receipt from a shoe store for a pair of sneakers I remembered, purple with a white stripe, the ones I had wanted badly enough that I had mentioned them 3 times before stopping myself. The 2013 box had a newspaper clipping from the Millhaven Courier, a photograph of my middle school science fair, me standing next to a poster about water filtration, grinning the particular grin of a 12-year-old who has stayed up too late and is running on sugar and pride. He had cut it out and saved it. He had put it in a plastic sleeve. He had labeled the sleeve Science Fair, November 2013 in his blocky handwriting, and tucked it into a box in a storage unit. He drove to every month to pay $68 he did not have a lot of, because it mattered to him that these things existed somewhere safe. Because it mattered to him that I existed somewhere safe, documented, accounted for, even if he never found the words to say so directly. I went through 4 of the boxes before I let myself cry, and when I did cry, it was not the kind of crying that is loud or dramatic. It was the other kind, the kind that happens quietly and without warning, the kind that feels less like grief and more like something being released that had been held in place for a very long time. I sat on the concrete floor of Unit 47 with a plastic-sleeved newspaper clipping in my lap, and I cried for a few minutes, and then I stopped and wiped my face with the sleeve of my jacket and kept going because that is what you do. That is what he had taught me to do, actually without ever using those words. You keep going. You file the papers. You write down the phone numbers. You make sure the important things are somewhere they can be found. The larger boxes on the right wall held his tools, mostly. Good ones, not the kind you buy from a discount bin, but the kind you accumulate over years of caring about the work. A set of hand planes in a wooden case he had built himself, each one nestled in a felt-lined slot. Chisels with wooden handles worn smooth at the grip. A folding rule, the old kind, brass-jointed, the kind you never see anymore. A level so old the vial was yellowed, but still true. These are not the tools of a man who dabbled. These were the tools of a man who was serious about something, who had learned something properly, who took care of his things because his things mattered to him. I had known he was handy. He fixed things around the house, small repairs, nothing remarkable, but I had not known about this. I had not known that there was a version of my father that existed before I knew him, a version that had built furniture and worked with his hands at a level that required a fitted case and felt-lined slots. The guitar case held a guitar, as it turned out, a battered acoustic with a crack in the body that had been repaired so carefully you had to look hard to find it. There was a folded piece of paper tucked under the strings. I unfolded it. It was a list of chord progressions in my father's handwriting, practiced until the paper was soft along the folds. Below the chord progressions, in smaller letters, he had written a single sentence. For Cecily, if she wants it. She might. I sat with that sentence for a long time. She might. 2 words that contained more of my father than almost anything else he had ever said to me out loud. Not she will, or she should, or I hope she does, but the careful, honest, slightly uncertain she might of a man who respected the fact that I was a separate person from him with my own preferences and my own choices, even at the age whenever he had written it. Even when I was small enough that my preferences were still mostly forming. She might. I might. I do, as it happens. I learned. The plastic bins held photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, sorted not chronologically, but by subject. There was a bin labeled family that held photographs going back before my birth, before his marriage, back to his own childhood, his mother and father standing in front of a house I did not recognize, his brother Dale as a teenager with a bicycle, my father himself at maybe 10 years old, squinting into the sun with an expression I recognized, because it was my expression, the one I make when I am trying to figure something out. There was a bin labeled Cecily that held every photograph he had ever taken of me, from the hospital the day I was born through what looked like my last day of high school. A photo I had not known he took of me walking to his truck in my graduation dress. Not posed, not looking at the camera, just walking. Just existing. Just being his kid on an ordinary, extraordinary day. And then there was the box at the back of the unit with my name on it. And by the time I finally stood up and walked to the folding table and put my hands on it, the light through the open unit door had gone the long golden color of late afternoon, moving toward evening, and Patty had come back twice to check on me quietly and gone away again, both times without saying anything except that she would be at the desk whenever I was ready. No hurry. I was grateful for that. I'm still grateful for that. The small kindnesses of strangers during the worst stretches of your life have a way of staying with you longer than almost anything else. The box was not heavy. I lifted the flaps and looked inside, and the first thing I saw was an envelope with my name on it, sealed, and beneath the envelope a stack of items arranged with the same deliberate care as everything else in that unit. I picked up the envelope first. My name was written on the front in his handwriting, and below my name, in smaller letters, he had written, "Non-emergency. Take your time," which was such a complete and specific thing for him to write that it cracked me open all over again, because it meant he had imagined me standing there. He had imagined me finding this and had known, or guessed, or feared that I might be frightened, and he had wanted to tell me I did not need to be. Not an emergency. Take your time. As if he were still there. As if he were standing just outside the door of the unit, waiting for me to be ready, giving me the space I needed, the way he always had, the way that had sometimes felt like distance when it was actually just respect. I did not open the letter right away. I set it down carefully on top of the box and looked at what else was inside. There was a savings account passbook from a bank I did not recognize in my name, with a balance that made me sit down on the folding table which was not designed for sitting and protested with a creak but held. The balance was not a fortune. It would not change anyone's life in the movies. But it was enough. Enough for a year of community college. Enough for first and last month on an apartment. Enough for a used car if mine finally gave out. Enough for the kind of enough that means you do not have to be afraid of the next immediate thing. He had been putting money into an account in my name for years. Quietly, without telling me, without making it a gift or an announcement or a reason for me to feel grateful or obligated, just putting it away the way he put everything away, methodically, without fanfare, because it mattered and he wanted it to be there when I needed it. There was also a folded document at the bottom of the box, legal-sized, which turned out to be a deed. A deed to a small piece of land outside of Millhaven, 11 acres out past where the county road turns to gravel, land I had driven past without knowing it was ours. His name was on the deed, and below his name, in an addendum that had been notarized and dated 3 years earlier, my name had been added as joint owner. He had done that when I was 15. He had gone to a notary and had my name put on a deed to 11 acres of land when I was 15 years old and had never said a word about it. And the reason he had never said a word about it, I understood sitting in that storage unit in the fading light, was that he was not the kind of man who gave gifts by making you watch him give them. He was the kind of man who made sure the thing was there, secured and real and waiting, and trusted you to find it when you needed it. I picked up his letter then, finally, and held it in both hands the way you hold something whose smallness has nothing to do with how much it weighs. The letter was 2 pages, written on lined paper in his blocky handwriting, the kind of handwriting that does not waste space or decoration. He had written it in pencil, which surprised me at first and then did not, because pencil was what he kept in his shirt pocket, always, the same short carpenter's pencil worn down to a stub that he replaced from a box in the kitchen drawer whenever it got too small to hold. He had probably written this the same way he wrote everything, at the kitchen table, early, before the house woke up, with his coffee cooling beside him and the particular silence of a morning he had decided to use carefully. He started by saying he was sorry. Not the way people say sorry when they want the conversation to move past the apology quickly, but the way a person says sorry when they have thought about it for a long time and want to make sure the weight of it is felt before anything else is said. He wrote that he knew disappearing was a terrible thing to do and that there was no version of it that was not terrible, and that he was not writing this letter to explain it away or ask for understanding he had not earned. He wrote that some things he had done in his life he could trace back to a reason, and some things he could not, and leaving the way he left was in the second category, and he had enough honesty left in him to admit that rather than construct a story that made it seem deliberate or brave. It was not deliberate, and it was not brave. He wrote, "I broke. I want you to know I know that." Then he wrote about me. He wrote that he had not been a perfect father, which I already knew, and that the ways he had fallen short were not things he could undo, but were things he had thought about more than I probably realized. He wrote that the drinking had gotten bad in the last year, and that he had known it and had not known how to stop it, and that the shame of that, on top of everything else, had become something he could not see past. He wrote that he was not telling me this to excuse himself, but because he thought I deserved the truth more than I deserved a cleaned-up version of him. And that if there was one thing he hoped I had learned from watching him, it was the difference between those two things, because the world would offer me cleaned-up versions of things my whole life, and I should know how to recognize the real ones. He wrote about my mother briefly and without bitterness, which surprised me. He wrote that she had her own reasons for leaving, and that he had spent years being angry about it, and had eventually come to understand that anger at someone for not being able to stay is one of the least useful things a person can carry, and that he hoped I would not carry it on his behalf either. He wrote, "You don't owe either of us your resentment. Spend it somewhere it does some good." He wrote about the storage unit. He explained the yearly boxes the way I had already come to understand them, though hearing it in his words made it different. He wrote that he had started keeping them because in the year after my mother left, he had felt like things were slipping and he needed a way to prove to himself that they were not, that our life together was real and documented and could not be taken away just because it felt fragile. He wrote that it had become something he looked forward to the end of every year, going through the receipts and the school papers and the photographs and putting them in a box and labeling it and knowing they were safe. He wrote, "I know it is a strange thing to do. I'm a strange man. You knew that. He wrote about the land. He said it had belonged to his father, my grandfather, who I had barely known before he died when I was 7, and that it had come to him in a small inheritance that he had almost sold twice, and both times had not been able to go through with it. He wrote that he did not know what the land was worth, probably not much, but that it was real, and it was paid for, and it was ours, and that he had put my name on it, because he wanted me to have something he could not accidentally lose, or drink away, or let slip through his hands in a bad month. He wrote, "The land stays. Whatever else happens, the land stays." He wrote that if I ever wanted to do something with it, I should. And if I never wanted to do anything with it, that was fine too. He wrote, "It doesn't have to be anything. It just has to be yours." The last paragraph was short. He wrote that he loved me in the way that is bigger than the word, the way that does not fit inside ordinary saying, and that he knew he had not always shown it in ways I could easily read, and that he was sorry for that too. He wrote that he hoped I would build something good, not for him, not to prove anything to anyone, but because I was capable of it and because good things deserve to be built. He wrote, "You are the best thing I ever did, Cecily. I need you to know that even if you never hear from me again, especially then." He signed it the way he signed everything, the way he signed the Christmas cards he sent to his brother every year without fail. Just Ray. Not Dad, not your father, not love always. Just Ray. Himself, plainly, without performance, the same way he had always been. I sat with that letter until the light outside the unit had gone fully gray, and Patty came back a third time, and this time stood a little closer and said gently that they would be locking the gate at 9, and it was coming up on 8:30. I folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest, where I kept it for a long time after that. I did not take everything that night. I took the letter and the savings passbook and the deed and the box labeled Cecily from the yearly stack, the one with the newspaper clipping and the shoe store receipt and the 4th grade teacher list. I took the guitar. I left everything else where it was, organized and waiting, and I told Patty I would be back, and she said to take all the time I needed and gave me a proper key that she had cut from a spare, and I drove home in the dark with the guitar in the back seat and the letter against my chest, and something in me that had been braced for a very long time beginning, slowly and carefully, to come undone. The land was real. I drove out to see it the following weekend, on a morning that was cold but clear, the kind of March morning that cannot decide if it is still winter or has agreed to be something else. The county road turned to gravel exactly when my father's directions said it would, and then there was a gate, aluminum, unlocked, and beyond it 11 acres of mixed woodland and open field with a creek running along the eastern edge, still half frozen, making the sound that half-frozen creeks make, which is the sound of something that has been still for a long time beginning to move again. I stood at the gate for a while before I went in. The way you stand before things that are yours when being yours is still a new and improbable feeling. I walked the whole thing that morning. It took about an hour. The woodland was mostly second-growth oak and maple, nothing old growth, nothing dramatic, just honest trees doing the quiet work of being trees. There was a flat section near the center where the ground had been cleared at some point, years ago, maybe decades, and the grass had come back in thick, and even the kind of flat open space that suggests someone once had a plan for it. At the back of the property, near the creek, there was a concrete foundation, low to the ground, almost entirely reclaimed by moss and creeper, the ghost of a building that had stood there once and was gone now. I crouched beside it and put my hand on the concrete, which was cold and solid and real, and thought about my father driving out here on some ordinary Saturday, walking the same ground I was walking, standing at the same creek, keeping this place in his mind the same way. He kept everything quietly without telling anyone, making sure it was safe and real and waiting for when it was needed. I went back many times that spring, at first just to walk it, to learn it, to understand what I had been given. Then with a notebook, making rough sketches, thinking about what the flat center section could hold, what the creek access meant, what the foundation footprint told me about the scale of what had been there before. I'm not an architect. I was 18 years old working the morning shift at a diner. But I had grown up watching a man who knew how to look at a thing and understand what it could become. And some of that had gone into me the way things go into you from the people who raise you, without your permission, without your noticing, until one day you reach for it, and it is there. I used the savings account carefully, the way he would have wanted me to, which is to say slowly and with a plan. Community college in the fall, as I had intended, with enough left over to feel stable, which is a feeling I had not been sure I would ever have again after the Tuesday in March when his truck pulled out of the driveway and did not come back. I studied land management and construction basics and environmental science, the kind of curriculum that does not lead to a single obvious job, but leads instead to a way of thinking about land and buildings and the relationship between them that has turned out to be exactly what I needed. My father has not been found. I want to tell you that clearly because this story does not have that particular resolution, and I have had to make my peace with the fact that it may never. The case is still open. I still check periodically the way you check something you have not given up on, even when you have learned to live with its absence. I do not know if he is alive. I do not know if he chose to disappear entirely or if something happened to him that removed the choice. I hold both possibilities the way you hold things that cannot be resolved, which is carefully and at a certain distance, and with the understanding that not knowing is its own kind of answer, even if it is not the one you would have chosen. What I know is what he left. I know the yearly boxes, every one of them, which I have now read through completely, which together tell the story of a man doing his best with what he had in the years that he had it. I know the land, which I walk still, which I'm slowly building something on. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would photograph well for a magazine, just a small structure on the flat center section, timber-framed, simple, the kind of thing my father's tools were built for, and that I am learning to build with them because they are mine now, and because learning to use them feels like the closest thing to a conversation I'm still able to have with him. I know the guitar, which I play badly and without self-consciousness in the early mornings, the same mornings he used to love, before anything has gone wrong yet. And I know the letter, which I have read more times than I can count, and which I know now mostly by heart, the way you know things that have become part of how you understand yourself. I broke, he wrote. You are the best thing I ever did. The land stays. The land stays. I have thought about those two words more than almost any others. In the context of a man who felt like everything was slipping, who could not hold together the ordinary things, who left without saying goodbye. In that context, the land stays is not a small thing. It is the largest thing. It is the thing he drove out to on ordinary Saturdays and walked alone and kept in his mind as proof that something could be real and solid and beyond the reach of bad months and bad years, and the particular kind of breaking that happens to people who have been holding too much for too long. He gave it to me because it was the most permanent thing he had. He gave it to me when I was 15 because he was already afraid, already felt the edges of himself beginning to blur, and he wanted to make sure that whatever happened to him, I would have something that could not be taken. I am 23 now. The structure on the flat center section has walls and a roof and a wood stove in the corner that I light on cold mornings when I am working out there, which is most mornings. The creek unfreezes every March, right around the anniversary of the Tuesday he left, and every year I go stand at the bank and listen to the sound of something moving again after a long stillness. And every year it is different, and every year it is the same. I have not stopped looking for him. I have not stopped hoping. But I have also learned, slowly and with difficulty, the difference between waiting for someone to come back and building your life as if they might, which turns out to be a much better way to love someone who is gone. The box with my name on it lives on the shelf above my desk in the small structure on the land that is mine. The letter is inside it, in its envelope, in his handwriting, signed the way he always signed things. Just Ray. Plainly, without performance. Himself, exactly right up to the end. If this story found you in a place where something is missing, where someone is gone and the silence they left is louder than anything else, I want you to know that the silence is not the whole story. Sometimes the people who cannot stay still find ways to leave what matters behind. Sometimes the room you were never shown holds everything they could not say. Sometimes what is left behind is more than enough to build from. Sometimes it is exactly enough. The summer I turned 24, a woman showed up at the land. I heard her truck before I saw her. An old Silverado, silver gone a primer and patches, the exhaust a little rough on the idle, the kind of sound you learn to read when you grow up around people who maintain their vehicles out of necessity rather than pride. I was on the roof of the small structure, checking the flashing around the stovepipe, and I looked down and watched her park at the gate and sit in the cab for a long moment before she got out. She was maybe 60, maybe a hard 55, with gray-streaked hair, pulled back practical, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of physical work. Not stiff, but steady like a person who has learned exactly how to carry themselves because they've had to think about it. She walked to the gate and looked at the structure and then looked around the property the way people look at land when they know what they're looking at. Not admiring, assessing. I climbed down. She introduced herself as Carol Vasquez. She said she had known my father. I want to tell you what that sentence did to me because I think it is important to be honest about it. It did not feel like relief. It felt like the ground shifting under something I had built carefully on the assumption that the ground was fixed. It felt like the possibility of knowing something I had decided, slowly and with difficulty, to be at peace with not knowing. I said how. She said they had worked together briefly years ago at a job site in Stroudsburg. She said he had mentioned the land more than once, the 11 acres, the creek, the foundation at the back. She said she had not thought about it in years until she drove through Millhaven on her way somewhere else and saw the name on a road sign and remembered. I asked her inside. She sat at the small table I had built from reclaimed oak, the same kind of careful joinery I had found in the tool case, the hand planes and chisels that I had spent 18 months learning to use properly. And I made coffee in the same way my father made it, black and without ceremony, and I set a mug in front of her and sat down. She told me what she knew. It was not much, and it was also more than I had had before, which is how it always goes with the pieces people carry around without knowing they're carrying them. She said he had talked about me. Not constantly, not in a way that would have stood out as unusual, but the way a person mentions something that is quietly central to them, incidentally, honestly, without meaning to make a point of it. She said he had said once that he had a daughter who was going to figure things out, and that he meant it not as a boast, but as a statement of fact, the way you state things you are simply certain of. She said she did not know where he had gone. I told her I did not either. We sat with that for a while, the way you sit with things that have no resolution, which by now I was practiced at. Then she asked about the structure, and I told her about it, and she asked about the foundation at the back of the property, and I took her to see it. We walked through the woods, through the second-growth oak and maple that were thick with July, and she looked at the foundation with the same assessing as she had used on everything else, and said her late husband had been a mason. She said she could see from the pour that it was old, maybe 1940s, probably a farmhouse or a large outbuilding, the kind of structure that would have been built to last and had lasted right up until whatever happened to it. I asked what she thought happened to it. She shrugged the shrug of a woman who has learned that most things happen without particularly good explanations. She said, fire, probably, or just people moving on. She said, land remembers what stood on it, but it doesn't hold a grudge. I wrote that down later. I write things down the way my father filed papers, not because I plan to use them necessarily, but because I want them to be somewhere real. Carol Vasquez had a cup of coffee and looked at my land and told me a small thing about my father and then drove away in her Primer Patch Silverado, and I watched her go and stood in the open doorway of the structure for a long time after the sound of her engine faded out toward the county road. The creek was audible from where I stood. It had been a wet spring, and the water was still high, still quick, still making the sound of something that had been still and was now moving. I went inside and took the box with my name on it down from the shelf and held it for a while without opening it. I did not always open it. Sometimes I just hold it, the way you hold something to remind yourself it is real. Sometimes that is enough. I finished the structure that fall, by which I mean I finished it enough. There is a version of finishing that is complete and a version that is livable, and they're not always the same thing. And I have learned to be at peace with the livable version while still working toward the complete one. The walls were tight. The stove was good. The roof did not leak. The floor was wide plank oak milled from a tree that had come down in the northwest corner of the property in a windstorm 2 winters before, and I had paid a man with a portable sawmill to cut it into boards, and I had dried them myself and laid them myself. And they were not perfect, and they were exactly right. I had a neighbor by then, a man named Prentice, who farmed the land to the south, and who had come to check on me that first spring with the particular wariness of someone who has seen a lot of young people buy rural land and not last through the first winter, and who had slowly, over 2 years, revised his assessment without ever saying so directly. He lent me equipment when I needed it and gave me advice when I asked for it and stayed out of my business when I did not, which is about the best you can hope for in a neighbor and better than most people get. Prentice had known my grandfather. I discovered this accidentally, the way you discover most things that matter, sideways, through an unguarded moment. He had mentioned the creek, and I had mentioned the property line, and he had said your grandfather put that line in, and I had stopped what I was doing and looked at him, and he had looked back with the expression of a man who realizes he has said something larger than he intended. He told me what he knew, which was that my grandfather, my father's father, the one who had died when I was 7 and left the land in a small inheritance, had worked this ground for nearly 20 years before age made him practical. He said he had been a quiet man with good hands and a distrust of waste, the kind of man who fixed things before they broke and was always ready for the next hard season. He said, I could see it in your father sometimes when he came out here, the same way of looking at things. I asked when my father had come out here. Prentice said, off and on over the years. More in the last year before he disappeared. He said he had seen my father's truck at the gate more times than he could count, just parked there, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. He said he had never stopped to ask because it had not seemed like his business, and that was a decision he had thought about more than once since. I told him there was nothing he could have done. I believed it when I said it, which meant I had come further than I thought. I have turned this over many times since. My father parking his truck at the gate of the land that was also by then my land, the addendum 3 years old, my name on the deed, 15-year-old me, unknowingly co-owner of 11 acres I would not see for 3 more years, and just sitting there, not walking it, not working it, just sitting in the cab of his truck at the gate looking at something that was real and paid for and beyond the reach of bad months. I think I understand it. I think that is what the land was for him in those last years. Not a project, not a plan, but a proof. Proof that something solid existed. Proof that something would stay. He went there the way you go to a thing that reminds you the world is still arranged in a way that makes sense, even when you yourself are not. He gave it to me, so I would have that too. So I would have somewhere to go when everything else felt like it was sliding. He knew, or feared, that I would need it. He was right. I needed it the same spring I found it, and I have needed it many times since, and it has been there every time. There's a question I'm asked sometimes by people who learn the shape of this story, and I want to answer it directly because I think it deserves a direct answer. They ask if I am angry at him. The honest answer is yes and also no, and the two of those coexist in me without resolving, and I have made my peace with that too. I am angry at the Tuesday in March, at the $20 under the salt shaker, at the rinsed mug turned upside down like punctuation at the end of a sentence I was not given time to read. I am angry at the way his absence moved through the years of my young adulthood like a draft under a door. Never absent entirely, always finding the moments I was most tired, most uncertain, most in need of the particular thing only a parent can give, which is the sense that someone who has already survived being your age is watching and believes you can do it too. I am angry at the drinking, at the quiet of it, at the way he could sit in a chair and be somewhere else entirely while I sat across from him trying to find him. I am angry that he could not find, in all the love he clearly had and clearly felt, a way to stay. And also, I have read the yearly boxes. All of them, now, every page of every folder, every receipt and report card and school photograph and utility bill filed in order by month. I have held the list of my 4th grade teachers with their phone numbers in his handwriting. I played the guitar he left for me. I have stood on the land he gave me and watched the creek unfreeze every March and felt the grief and the gratitude arrive together. Inseparable, the same feeling wearing 2 faces. He was broken in a way he could not fix and did not know how to ask for help fixing. That is a real thing and a hard thing, and it does not excuse what he did, and it does not disappear when I look at what he left. Both are true. Both matter. The anger is real, and the love underneath it is realer. And I have learned that you can hold both without having to choose between them. That in fact choosing between them would be a kind of dishonesty I no longer have the patience for. I am 24 years old. I have 11 acres and a structure with a wood stove and a floor of salvaged oak. I have my father's tools, which I have learned to use. I have his guitar, which I play badly and without apology in the early mornings. I have his letter, which I know by heart. I have a savings account he built for me $1 at a time, and a land deed with both our names on it, and a box of yearly records that together tell the story of a man who loved me as well as he could in the only language he had fully mastered, which was the language of making sure. I have the creek. I have the foundation at the back of the property, slowly being reclaimed, patient, waiting to tell me what it once was and what it might be again. I have the flat center section, which is no longer flat. There is a structure on it now, my structure, built with his tools in my hands and 2 years of learning what I did not know. I have Prentice to the south, who lends me equipment and says little and means more than he says. I have Carol Vasquez somewhere in a primer-patched Silverado, carrying one small fact about my father she did not know she was carrying until a road sign reminded her. I have the March anniversaries, every one of them, standing at the creek in the cold, clear air, listening to the sound of something that was still for a long time beginning to move again. I have enough. I have exactly enough. And on the mornings when I am not sure of that, when the absence is louder than the having, when the Tuesday in March feels less like a chapter and more like an open wound, I go and stand at the gate of the property the way he used to, and I look at what is real, and I stay until I believe it again. The land stays. Whatever else happens, the land stays. He wrote it for me. I have learned to live it for myself. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.